Discover the transformative world of hypnosis and how it can lead you to a happier, healthier you. I'm Cindy Brainerd, a certified hypnotherapist from the Hypno Wellness Podcast, and your guide to finding wellness through the power of hypnosis. Join us every Wednesday for insightful topics and Thursdays for empowering hypnosis sessions. Remember, Hypno Wellness, your path to a better you.
The Murder Shelf Book Club contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Listener discretion is advised.
What a chimera then is man. What a novelty. What a monster. What chaos. What a contradiction. What a prodigy. Judge all things, feeble earthworm, depository of truth, sink of uncertainty and error, the glory and the shame of the universe. That's Blaise Pascal, 17th century philosopher, scientist, and mathematician, from Moonshine Over Georgia, a novel based on actual events by Chris Skates. Well, welcome to the Murder Shelf Book Club podcast. I am your host, Jill. This is another special episode, episode 128, on Moonshine Over Georgia, a novel based on actual events by the incredible Chris Skates. A novel, you say? Yes, but a novel based on the true story as lived by Chris's grandfather. Very young, Chris was captivated by his grandfather's colorful tales. The depth, scope, and intimacy of the story are engaging because we are invited into the internal monologue of the protagonist, Cullen Kid Miller, a Georgia revenue agent working in the aftermath of World War II. Well, exactly what the heck is a revenue agent? So let me provide you a bit of history. Back in 1919, the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified, prohibiting the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors throughout the United States. This era is known as Prohibition, during which the U.S. is dry, with alcohol banned. The intent behind Prohibition was noble, to reduce alcoholism and the social problems associated with it. However, the unintended consequences included the rise of bootlegging, speakeasies, secretive bars where illegal alcohol was sold and consumed, and organized crime. Revenue agents, like Chris's grandfather, were tasked with uncovering caches of alcohol and destroying stills that produced the moonshine. Now, with the onset of the Great Depression in the 1930s, the 18th Amendment was repealed on December 5, 1933, when the new 21st Amendment was ratified. Now, Georgia has its own historical nuances that add to this national narrative. The dry colony of Georgia was established in 1733 by many Scotch-Irish immigrants. But there were others, of course, too, but a lot of them were Scotch-Irish immigrants who had a long-standing cultural tradition of brewing their own alcohol. Quote, making moonshine began as a respected way for poor farm families to make a few bucks. But it turned into an illegal activity when moonshiners refused to pay the taxes on their shine. When alcohol was outlawed altogether, moonshiners took on a gangster-type persona, end quote. In 1908, a decade before the national prohibition, Georgia implemented a statewide ban on alcohol, ushering in the uneasy era of temperance. 30 years later, Governor Urith D. Rivers signed the revenue tax, which legalized, and controlled alcoholic beverages and liquors, effectively nullifying all remaining statewide prohibitive laws. At the same time, the Georgia Department of Revenue responsible for enforcing the laws and regulations related to the sale and distribution of alcoholic beverages and tobacco products, came into being. Making your own moonshine remained illegal, and thus we have revenue agents who are assigned to tackle this crime, confiscating illegal hooch, dismantling stills, and disrupting the smuggling. Now back to the book. Moonshine Over Georgia tells the story of the murder of Wilson Turner, who crossed paths with powerful men involved in bootlegging. With the stage set, let me introduce you to Mr. Chris Skates, a former speechwriter and policy advisor for 2 administrations, as well as a chemist for 30 years. Chris has written 4 novels and over 300 articles and short stories. One of his notable works is The Rain, co-written with Dan Tankersley. It is an utterly terrifying story that explores the frightening reality of what it was like aboard Noah's Ark, depicting a world where all life is extinguished due to wickedness. And this version has no hugging of giraffes. Then the story continues in Chris's next book, The Tower. Chris was born in Georgia and has lived in 25 states so far, and he embodies old Southern cultural traditions. He currently resides in Kentucky with his wife, adult children, and 2 grandchildren. So let me welcome Chris Skates to the Murder Shelf Book Club podcast. I am so thrilled that he has joined us.
Hi, Jill.
Hi there. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for having me on, and thank you for taking time to read the book. So much more fun for me as an author to engage with someone that's read the story.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. When I got your questions, I was touched because I was like, she really gets it. She gets the story. She gets what I was trying to convey.
Oh, absolutely. What a treasure it is to have you present the story as you remember and you recall from those years growing up at your grandfather's knees, listening to these stories. These tales that we have are classic, I think, to every family.
Yeah.
But there's someone, it may not be a grandparent, but there's someone there who's telling them the stories of the past and preserving those stories, that oral history.
Yeah. And my mother is in the book. She's Judy. She's the little toddler. And I just lost her last year. She was 86. But I'm so grateful. She got dementia towards the end of her life, but I'm so grateful that I finished the manuscript before she started having problems with that. So she was the first person I wanted to read it because she was the only family member that had actually experienced it, even though she'd experienced it as a little girl. And she took a couple weeks with it, and she called me, and she was sobbing. And it's the greatest review I'll ever get. She said, "Chris, it's not like you wrote a story about my father. It's like you channeled my father." She said, "You wrote scenes that I lived through, that it was like you were in the room with us. I had completely forgotten what happened. And then when I read your scene, I was back there." So, I just could not have gotten a better review. And then after she had dementia, I was able to produce the audiobook, which I hired a wonderful voice actor to play the part of my grandfather. And her nurse, where she was staying, and she had to have round-the-clock care at that point, she couldn't concentrate enough to read a book. But her nurse played the audiobook for her. This was 2 years after she had read the manuscript, maybe 3. And she hadn't spoken at all that day. And when she listened to the audiobook for about 5 minutes, and she sat up in her bed and she said, "I hear my daddy." So the words that I wrote on behalf of her father and that the actor spoke resonated with her so vividly that she recognized it as her own father.
Yeah. See, I think that's absolutely phenomenal. You were that good.
Thank you. Yeah, I really captured his. I was so mesmerized by him, and we were so close. I've never had, even though I had a good relationship with my father overall, I've never had a relationship with another man that was that close, where we had that many things in common. We liked all the same hobbies, and just spending time with him was just the highlight of my life. And so she told me that day that she was reviewing the manuscript, she said, I can tell you hung on his every word. You remembered everything he told you.
He must have had quite the gift for the gab.
Well, that's the funny part. He did when he wanted to. When he would tell you about a hunting trip he went on or a fishing trip, he was a great storyteller, but he didn't like to talk about himself. And so the law enforcement stuff, I had to just pull out of him. And that's the one regret I have, is that I wasn't a writer yet when we were spending a lot of time together, and I didn't know the type of questions I should have asked. I was just having conversations with him. And of course, especially as a young boy, I was always like, did you ever shoot anybody, Pop? You know, and I always called him Pop. And that was the part he didn't like to talk about. I will say this, one of the things he was the most proud of is he never shot anyone in the line of duty, or he never shot anyone, period. And he wanted to have a minimal amount of time that he pulled, he called it. If he pulled his gun, it took everything into a whole nother realm. So he was very proud of the fact that most of the time he never had to draw his gun. And one of the reasons he didn't is because he was so good, guys didn't want to mess with him. He says that early in the book. By commanding that respect, it made him and the suspects safer.
Absolutely. That absolutely comes through. You know, I do true crime, you know, and this is a novel, but I felt like I was there in the room with Agent Miller. And because of the way you wrote it with this internal monologue, you're hearing his thinking, which you know is just moments. Looking at this one, reading the body language, to me, it was riveting. I couldn't put the book down.
I get such great reviews on the book. I have the same problem that every author has, getting the book out there. 99.9% of America doesn't know the book exists. But I've sold around 3,000, and I have gotten at least 300 people that have reached out to me. When a person likes your book so much that they take the time to find you on Facebook and send you a message or send you an email, and I've got to get a website going at some point, but then they really were moved by the book if they take the time to do that. And I've gotten so many heartfelt messages. And I just did a book signing down in Georgia, and I got to speak. You can see some photos on my Facebook page if you want to look. They restored the courtroom that's in my book to look exactly like it did at the Wallace trial. And they even had original furniture back in there. And so the historian told me, he said, that may very well be the chair your grandfather sat in and testified. And when I went to do the speaking, this was just last week, an elderly gentleman came first. He came like 45 minutes early. He had a walker, and he had an assistant with him. And she came up to me and she said he wanted to be here early because he was hoping you would come talk to him. So I said, I'd be glad to. So I went over to him. His face was drawn. He had clearly had a stroke at some point. And he said, son, I'm 92 years old. He said, when I was 11 years old, I sat right up there in that balcony and I watched your grandfather testify. And I got chill bumps on my chill bumps. And he said, and that trial inspired me. And I grew up to be an attorney and then a judge. And he said, I tried cases in this very courtroom before I retired. And he said, I cannot wait to read your book. So just those kind of connections, it's just amazing. This happened 77 years ago, but there's still people that, even if the living witnesses are starting to pass away, their kids heard about it. It's just such a strong legend in Georgia, especially Western Georgia.
I'm not amazed, actually, that these things are happening to you, because it's such a compelling story.
Yeah.
You also managed to cast the moral questions, which I also thought was phenomenal, of temptation. Here's your grandfather, and he's going through this, and you know that there are bad guys in this story, and they've done bad things, and they're looking the other way, or they're taking some money, or even some moonshine, or whatever, and they have failed that temptation. And yet your grandfather did not.
Right.
And that is powerful. This world needs to hear that story.
Yeah, and I really wanted that dichotomy to be the core of the story. And you notice in the beginning, I have that Blaise Pascal quote, which I probably would need to grab the book to say it correctly, but where he says, what a chimera is man, what a beauty, what a chaos, glory and shame of the universe.
I'm opening this episode with that quote.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for doing that. And by the way, Amazon Audible cut that quote off, and I'm so mad at them. So they could do this is Audible. They stomped right over that. But luckily, I say it again later in the book, so the reader still gets it. Anyway, I digress. That dichotomy is what I wanted to craft the story around. So I really picked the inscription before I wrote the book. And so then I developed the story in that way. And people always wonder about fiction versus nonfiction. My grandfather, this is the way I like to describe it. My grandfather left me with about 6,000 pieces of a 15,000 piece jigsaw puzzle. I used research to gather another 4,000 pieces, and I filled in the rest with fiction. But it was fiction based on my intimate relationship with my grandfather. And also knowing some of these other people when I was a boy, like Doc Cook, his partner. Doc Cook lived a mile away from my grandfather his whole life, and he came over to the house a lot, and he always knocked on the door like he was going to knock it down, just like I describe in the book. I love that saying that I had heard him say, and I used it in the book. Well, just excuse me all to pieces. He always said it like that. So I was able to draw on those childhood experiences and just sitting around and listening to these guys talk to develop that around that core. But here's an amazing thing that happened. When I did the audiobook, which came in a year and a half after the print book was published, I listened to it for the first time. It was the most surreal experience as a creative person to hear a professional actor bring characters to life that I somewhat created and somewhat based on real people. And when I heard him do the audiobook and I listened to the whole thing, it hit me. My gosh, this isn't just a story about good versus evil, my grandfather versus the bad guy. It's a story about me too. It's a story about within my own heart that sometimes I'm capable of being the nicest guy and so thoughtful and so compassionate. And other times I've said things that I've regretted so much later and like, well, gosh, that was a cruel thing to say, or that was a crappy thing to do. And so it really, I didn't realize how it would resonate with me and how much of myself was in the story. And it was subconscious.
I think that's absolutely true. I could see that because we all have those human moments.
Right.
Listen, none of us is perfect.
Right.
And everybody has a bad day and everybody makes a poor choice. And you have people in the book who make poor choices and come back.
Right.
I'm thinking of Delbert.
Delbert's one of my favorite characters.
Oh, and I'm not giving too much away because murder bookies, you're going to buy this book. You're going to take a break from true crime. Yes, this is me telling you this, but you're going to take a break from true crime and you're going to go read this book because I'm telling you, it is amazing. But Delbert, I was so mad at him.
Yeah.
And then I just wanted to hug him.
Mm-hmm. And, I didn't know what was going to happen with Delbert myself as a writer until I got to that latter scene that you know about that we won't reveal. Mm-hmm. And he just walked into the scene on his own almost. And I knew where it needed to go. And it made me cry as I was writing it.
Oh, I was crying when I was reading it. I understand. Even though I do true crime, I'm a mush. Yeah. When the story gets to me, it gets to me. And knowing that this is based on real people. Right. I was absolutely amazed. I have read true crime books where they've changed the name of people to protect them and shield their identity and, prevent any pain or heartache, years later of the stories and all of this. But here I have this novel and everybody's name, it's right there. Yeah. Because I went and did the research. I went and I looked up the trial and I read all the newspaper stories about what was happening, what the testimony was. And I mean, you nailed it.
Yeah. Thank you. And there are two names. I had to end up changing three names. I changed the other revenuer, Hitchcock. I changed his name slightly because I didn't want to get sued. And you've got a great question in your email that we need to get to. Has anybody ever gotten mad at me? Yes, they have. And it was related to him. But then also my mom called me after she got over being thrilled with the book. She called me and she said, "You changed the name of these Upson County liquor game boys. I've got to live down here with these people." Because the real names are very prominent business people now. So they took their moonshine profits and they built a legitimate business and they're probably multimillionaires now. So they're a very prominent family locally where my mother lived, and she didn't want to get crossways, as she called it, with them.
And I understand that. You want to tell the story, which, it's of a murder. A man is murdered.
Right.
And in a terrible, gruesome way. And remembering him, I'm always about remembering the victims.
Yeah.
And shielding the family and all of that. But if it's not out there, then it gets lost to history.
Right. Yeah. And I didn't want Murder in Coweta County, which, don't get me wrong, Margaret Barnes had a New York Times bestseller about the same case. And she did a phenomenal job in a lot of ways, but she missed some things too. And one of the reasons she missed some things is because she arranged a research meeting with my grandfather. I was just a little boy, and she didn't show up. And I think I know why she didn't show up. I don't want to ascribe motives on here, but she missed a lot of the facts by not talking to my grandfather, who was one of the most intimately involved law officers in the whole case.
Yeah. I had not seen the film, and I watched the film. I didn't read her book yet, but I will read her book. But I watched the film, which was okay.
Yeah, it's a little campy.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it has the bones and the outline of everything there. Frankly, though, it did not. I think it tried, but it did not really capture the horror of that crime.
Right. I agree.
It might have been 1983, the way they made films back then, but it did not. And it was a little disappointing in that sense.
Yeah.
There's just so much to that story. And I'm not saying that Wilson Turner was a saint by any means, but people don't deserve that.
Right. And Agent Miller even says that in the book.
Yeah, exactly. So other than the couple people you've mentioned, not too much pushback?
No, I have been amazed. I've had 6 book signings now in Georgia. I had one here in Kentucky. Now I've had more than one here, but it doesn't resonate with Kentuckians the way it does with Georgians, because it's not a part of Kentucky history. Every time I've had a book signing, I've connected with somebody, mostly in very positive ways, like the elderly man I just told you about. But at one particular book signing, a man came who I knew by name. He didn't know I knew him, but I knew him. And he had a pistol on his hip. He was a revenue agent after my grandfather, and he became partners with Hancock. Hancock remained a revenue agent into his 80s. He just wouldn't retire. And don't get me wrong, he was an effective agent. He was just, as my grandfather, the words in the book came right out of the mouth of my grandfather. He was brutal with suspects. He was a glory hound, and he was constantly seeking to get his name in the paper, which made him dangerous to the other revenue agents. But he was effective at finding steals. He was also a good tracker. But this guy had become Hancock's partner probably about 8 or 9 years after my grandfather was no longer a revenue agent, which we'll talk about that, why that happened later. But he comes up to me, and he had the book. He'd already read it, and it was dog-eared, and he had his pistol on his hip, and he was a big man, but he was in his late 70s. He threw the book down in front of me, and he said, "You were awful hard on Hancock." I said, "Well, I set out to write my grandfather's version of events, and that's what I did." And he said, "Well, Hancock was a hell of an agent. I went on a lot of raids with Hancock." And I said, "Well, maybe he got better with age." Mm-hmm. And he said, "Hancock was still raiding steals when he was in his 80s. He said something else about him." And I said, "Sam," and when I called his name, it really shocked him. He didn't know that I knew who he was. And I said, "Here's my business card." And I gave him one of my author cards and said, "There's my personal contact information. If you're so in love with Hancock, go write your own damn book. Right now, these people are waiting to get signed books. So if you want to talk about Hancock, you call me at that number. I'll talk to you all you want to." He's never called me. And then when I was doing the research and was doing a lot of interviewing of people, word got out, and an author who I won't name, she wrote one book about the Wallace trial, and she was Wallace's niece. And she was convinced that Wallace didn't kill Wilson Turner. And she was writing her book to that effect. So she got pretty angry with me. And at that time, I was actually going to try to write my entire book as a blog serial. I had a blog at the time. So I was going to do a post every week and tell the story. But it got to be such a good story, I wasn't doing it justice by writing it that quickly. So I pulled it off. But in the meantime, she saw some of the early chapters. One of the things she got mad at me about was completely valid, which was the book Murder in Coweta County and the movie depicted Wallace's wife to be a bimbo. She wasn't at all. And I didn't know that until this lady called me. After the lady called me, I did some checking with my mom and some other people and found out that she was right. She was a very respected woman. She was a very talented woman. Unfortunately, she was severely abused and mistreated by him. He left her penniless, by the way. He had a lot of money when he died, and he left it all to his mistress.
Oof.
So I corrected that. I changed her character because I had written her kind of like Murder in Coweta County, and I let the lady know, and she was appreciative. And then I said, there's a lot you don't know about John Wallace, that you're making some assumptions that are incorrect. So we ended up having some email conversations about it. And she stopped speaking to me for a long time, wouldn't return my emails. And then about 6 months later, she said, I did some more research based on what you told me, and you were right and I was wrong. And that was the last time she's ever talked to me. But that's okay. We basically smoothed everything over. So those are the two main pushbacks I've gotten. The rest of them have been really positive. Some of them have been incredibly eye-opening. When I spoke at the courtroom, I had another book talk the next night at a Pine Mountain Ladies Club, which was the most southern proper thing you ever saw. They were so cute. The average age was 75, but it was an old-timey women's club. They had a beautiful azalea garden outside their little clubhouse. And they did a lot of charity work. And,
of course they did.
Yeah. And I went in, and they had their little cucumber sandwiches with the crust cut off and just everything perfect, you know. And the president of the club, who was probably in her mid-70s herself, came over, and she seemed very serious. And she said, I need to talk to you. Is it okay if I sit with you while you eat? I said, yeah, absolutely. So she said, I loved your book. She said, I've read it 3 times. And she said, I need to tell you about something that happened with my father. He died last year. He was in his mid-90s. And she said, he had a deathbed confession.
Uh-oh.
He called the entire family together and said, I have to tell you something that I've never told anyone in my whole life. When he was a 17-year-old high schooler, he was out on a double date, and the girl in the back seat, apparently John Wallace, who had a lot of mistresses, had some lust for. He was a 40-something-year-old man at the time, big, burly, bald-headed guy with a wife, but yet he decided he was sweet on this girl. So he runs their car off the road into a ditch.
Oh, my God.
Runs around to the passenger door of the back door and pulls this young man out of the car and shoots him in the head.
Oh, my God.
And then puts his gun barrel in this man who was doing the confession as a 95-year-old, puts the gun barrel in his ear and says, if any of the 3 of you ever breathe a word about what you just saw, I'll kill you, I'll kill your parents, I'll kill your grandparents, and I'll burn your houses down. And so this man went through his life with that secret, terrified, and finally told his family a month before he died.
Wow.
And so Wallace was a total sociopath.
Oh, absolutely. I'm sitting here, I'm saying, oh, this man's a psychopath.
Yeah. He told me he was worse than Murder in Coweta County made him out to be.
Oh, yeah, I definitely thought that.
More blown away that my grandfather agreed to go to a midnight meeting with this guy at his barn in the middle of nowhere. I just drove by that barn last week. It's still there. It's in the middle of nowhere in 2025. I can't imagine how remote it was in 1946.
Seriously. This guy, Wallace, is a psychopath. He has the charming demeanor, very superficial, but nevertheless a very charming demeanor. In the film, he was buying pews for the church.
Yeah, he did do that.
Right. To do his good deeds and look what a good citizen I am. And 5 minutes later is, threatening to kill somebody if they ever talk to, tell the story.
Right.
Yeah, he's a psychopath.
Yeah. And there, at the beginning of the story, there's 2 little boys that Wallace gives groceries to and soda pops. That was my wife's grandfather.
Huh.
He lived down the road from Wallace. Our 2 grandfathers never knew each other. They met briefly at our wedding, and that was it. But my grandfather was much older than my wife's grandfather. So he thought Wallace was a great guy, even when he was an elderly man himself, because when they were very poor and hungry, Wallace brought them food. So he didn't want to believe that Wallace killed Turner either. In other words, the charm worked on that little family that lived down the road from Wallace.
Not just on that family, but the story gets out. It gets circulated around. Everyone says, oh, what a big-hearted, charitable guy.
Yeah.
And short of getting the glimpse to the inner mechanisms here, they're going to think he's a great guy. A lot of them count on that.
Yeah.
But he's a murderer.
Absolutely. Through and through.
I am also amazed that your grandfather went and met him in the middle of nowhere. I have to think that Wallace was a little nervous about him. He wanted to talk to him. He wanted to say his piece. He needed to do this. He didn't want witnesses. I get that. But he had to have been concerned about his ability to take him if he had to.
I think he was. And I think my grandfather knew that, and that's what made him willing to go to the meeting and what kept him alive. My mother remembered that night, and she said she was holding on to his leg and crying, begging him, and her mother was too, begging him not to go because they thought Wallace was going to kill him. But when I was doing my research, so I've got two major cases, as you know. I've got the Wallace murder case, but then I've also got the case of the Upson County liquor gang. And I have a commendation here. I'll get it out and show it to you, from the governor of Georgia for my grandfather. It says, this is to commend you for rounding up the Upson County liquor gang. So I didn't know about that case when I started writing the book. I had this paper. My mother gave me this strong box here while I was researching. I had seen it a lot when I was a boy, but I didn't know what had happened to it. But my mother had it. It's really just a tackle box. There's official papers in there. My grandfather did. And so she said, take this and see if there's anything in there that'll help you. And unfortunately, he burned a lot of his investigative stuff to protect his informants right before he died in 1995. Here's one for you. In addition to being a revenue agent, he sometimes did security work when the state asked him to. And one person have you ever heard of Warm Springs and the Little White House?
Oh, absolutely.
Can you read this?
I sure can.
Eleanor Roosevelt.
Eleanor Roosevelt. Yeah.
He protected Eleanor Roosevelt, and she signed that card for him. I start researching the Upson County liquor gang, and I'd get in touch with the Upson County Historical Society, who were very helpful. There it is. You can kind of see the seal up at the top.
Oh, I do. I absolutely see it. Department of Revenue. Yeah.
And it's really that old paper. It's so cool. But I called them and they said, well, we know there was a massive liquor making operation in Upson County, and it was in a place called Over the Top, which I have all this in my book. And we know that it got so big that they even had some casinos that they were able to fund and a house of prostitution in little old Thomaston, Georgia. It got to be a real party capital. So she said, but we don't know that name, Upson County Liquor Gang, and we don't know anybody that could help you. Some guy was going to take me to where the stills were, and I never did get to go down there and do that. But anyway, 5 or 6 weeks go by, and she called back. She said, we remembered something after we talked to you. We had a moonshiner come and speak to our historical society, old time's sake, 10 years ago. She said, I don't have his address. I don't have his phone number. All I have is his name, and I have a video of his appearance, which I still have on a CD somewhere here. I need to watch it again. But I did a bunch of detective work, and I found this guy in a nursing home in Panama City Beach, Florida. And he was 93. I've told you about several people that are in their 90s, but they would be because this happened 77 years ago. So the man was so clear-minded. His name was Jim Griggs, and he was really wanted to talk to somebody. He wanted to tell his story about the old days. And so I said, I didn't know if he would know my grandfather or not, and I didn't know if he would know the Upson County Liquor Gang. And I said, did you know a revenue agent named C.E. Miller? And he said, I didn't just know that son of a bitch. He's the one that threw me in jail.
Yes.
Yeah, I was like, yes, because now I had a living witness. And we talked for a couple hours. One of the things he told me, though, that really resonated with me, he said, son, I was in World War II. I saw a lot of combat. But he said, your grandpa was the only man I ever encountered that I would say was completely fearless. He said, your grandpa was fearless and he was relentless. He wanted moonshine out of his part of the state. And he said, he chased me through the woods one night on foot for 12 miles. And he said, I finally got away from him. But he said he caught me later and took me to jail. And he said, when we finished our whole conversation, one of the last things he said also gave me chills. He said, son, I want you to understand this about your grandpa. He said, somebody from your generation, you can't appreciate how big the woods were in the South back then. He said, our stills were miles away from any road. And he said, your grandpa would come after us by himself, and we all had a gun, and we would have shot him just as soon as looked at him. But he was really good at what he did. And he said he pretty well single-handedly shut down the liquor business in the western part of Georgia. And that was a huge compliment coming from a guy from the other side.
Right. Okay, this guy who was put into jail by your grandfather saying, listen, I got to give it to the guy.
Yeah.
I guess with age, you start to reflect back.
Yeah.
Maybe have a few regrets.
And the other thing he told me was, your grandfather was a tough SOB, but he was fair. He said there were a lot of times where he would arrest a young man that had children at a still, and he'd say, look, you've got small children. Go home for 30 days. Make sure your family's taken care of. Meet me at the jail at such and such a date, such and such a time. And he said, I don't think anybody ever stood him up because they were so grateful that he thought about their family. So that was the two sides of him that I tried to convey.
Well, I think you did a great job with that. You mentioned the children.
Yeah.
I know that your portrayal is accurate. Before my major career in podcasting, I taught history.
Oh.
So that's why you said, do I know Warm Springs? Yes, I know Warm Springs. So I know your portrayal of the kids. That also brought me to tears.
Yeah.
Because I know it's true. Listen, anybody who's short of money is in a bad way. But people today do not have the faintest clue what abject poverty was.
Yes, that's exactly the right way to put it. And may I convey the story to your listeners that I have in the author's note? What inspired me to write the book was I was 12. I would spend the whole summer with my grandparents. And we would always go fishing in the morning, and then we'd work in the garden, and then we'd come in, and my grandmother would have this massive Southern lunch, and then we would watch Andy Griffith. So we were watching an Andy Griffith rerun, and a character came on named Rafe Hollister, who was only on about 4 or 5 episodes. Interestingly, I saw him just the other day. I had turned the TV on, and one of the reruns was on. But he was a beautiful singer, but he was also the Mayberry moonshiner. Mm-hmm. So they were doing a little comedy skit with the moonshine still, and Otis was trying to buy moonshine. And my grandfather got really irritated, and he was in his 70s at this time. And he reached up and he just that was when TVs, you had to turn the switch off. He just smacked the TV off. And I looked up and his chin was quivering and he was tearing up. And I said, Pop, what's wrong? And he looked at me very seriously and his eyes were watery. And he says, it wasn't like that, son. He said, there was nothing funny about the moonshine business. He said, you think you've heard a little child cry? He said, wait till you drag their daddy, sick off a bad moonshine, out of a ditch somewhere. He's covered in vomit. And you take him home, and they're living in some shack to begin with. He said, you don't know poverty. He said, people were so poor in Georgia in the 40s, you wouldn't even recognize it. And he said, you'd get them home at midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, and their little children would be running around the yard in nothing but a cloth diaper because they didn't have clothes. Their bellies would be distended from hunger. And Daddy just spent 2 weeks grocery money on a gallon of moonshine. He said, that's when you heard a child cry. They would hold on to my leg and just wail. So I convey that very early in the book when he goes to Delbert's house the first time. And when he told me that, I was only a 12-year-old. I wasn't really a writer yet. I was starting to dabble in it. But I knew in my subconscious, I'm going to tell this story someday. Because really, we've romanticized moonshine a lot.
Oh, yes.
And there were moonshiners that cared about the quality of their product and made a good product. And you think about the Waltons and the little sisters making the recipe. Those moonshiners did exist, but they were only about half the moonshining population. 2 things happened in the 40s. You'll appreciate this as a historian. The price of moonshine skyrocketed. Prohibition was over. So why did the price go up? Well, because they rationed sugar for World War II. So one of the primary commodities was sugar to make the mash work. And also, guys were coming back from World War II, and they wanted a drink. And the Deep South was the Bible Belt. You didn't open a liquor store in most towns in the South. There were something called the Blue Laws.
Yes.
If you wanted to drink a liquor, you had to drink moonshine. The price of a gallon of moonshine, this is a real number, in 1941 in Georgia was $20. That was a fortune. At the same time, the same year, the average annual yearly farm income for farmers in Georgia was $400.
Think about that.
Yeah. So look at a percentage of income. And what that led to was a thing called shot houses. People started having bars in their house, and you couldn't afford a $20 gallon of liquor. Well, you could go in there and for $1 a shot, you could drink shots. And that's when the prostitution got started and more crime. So as the price of moonshine went up, the violence went up. And that's when all this thing with Wallace happened and the Upson County Liquor Gang. And as I say on the back of my book, people started getting trigger happy.
Mm-hmm. Well, Wallace got confident too.
Yeah.
You know, he had his people in place. He had intimidated the hell out of everybody who he was dealing with.
Right.
You know, making a good show of it every Sunday in church.
Yeah.
And handing out a bag of groceries here and there and kept everybody quiet and complacent until they weren't.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's when he gets caught up in this murder charge. I read all the articles up through his trial and the appeals and trying to get the sentence commuted and all of that.
I have a copy of a letter that he wrote from death row to try to get pardoned. And this is why it's kind of mind-blowing to me that murder in Coweta County didn't give my grandfather a more prominent role. The entire letter that Wallace wrote to the governor of Georgia to try to get pardoned, is about my grandfather and about the midnight meeting. And in Wallace's twisted mind, and I think his mind got more twisted as he got on death row and started realizing, hey, they might actually get me here.
Yeah.
His entire defense was, I told Agent Miller to run him out of the state of Georgia and he refused to do it. So I had to kill the boy. I had no choice. So he didn't even deny that he killed him at that point. But here's what was amazing. When I wrote the chapter about the midnight meeting, I totally based it on conversations that I had with my grandfather. That part and the part about the poker game bus are two that are completely built off of our conversations. But I had two fears. One fear that I didn't want to have, but it was kind of nagging me in the back of my mind. What if my grandfather exaggerated? I mean, it almost sounds too good to be true. Who would be brave enough to confront this killer on his own property in the midnight, in darkness? So did he maybe exaggerate it to make himself look tougher? And then the second thing was, am I remembering this right? We talked about this when I was 14 or 15 years old. I'm now 50. Maybe I'm not remembering it right. Well, after I had already written my rough draft, then I get this Wallace letter from a historian friend that was helping me do research. And it's not the original, it's a copy. But the whole letter is about the midnight meeting and my grandfather. And he described the meeting exactly the way my grandfather did and exactly the way I wrote it. So then I had corroboration. And Wallace had reason to make my grandfather look tougher. In Wallace's mind, the fact that my grandfather called him a liar made him feel less guilty for killing Turner. I couldn't get Agent Miller to believe that he was making liquor without my permission and run him out of the state of Georgia. So I had to kill the boy.
Yeah, I liked that part. Liked is a strong word for it. But I liked the twist there coming from Wallace that this guy's a problem for me. I'm going to get him taken out by the cops.
Yeah.
By the agents. And no, your grandfather went right past that and says, no. It's not going to happen that way.
Yeah.
So what about your family tree on the other side? Any moonshine hanging a couple little hooch in those branches anywhere?
This is amazing. On my mother's side, absolutely not. My grandfather was an adamant teetotaler, as was my grandmother. It was so far, I actually just wrote a new book of short stories, and I say this in one of my short stories about my grandparents. It was so far beyond the realm of human comprehension that anybody would even bring a drink of liquor within a mile radius of my grandmother's house, that nobody in the family would have even dreamed of drinking and have her know about it. But the other big sin in her mind was cigarettes. She thought cigarettes were one of the worst things, and she was always preaching to me, don't ever take the first puff and you won't ever want the second one. That was her saying. And so nobody on my mother's side at all, and if they did it way away from her. But on my father's side, this is really ironic. My father's father, who I never knew, he died before I was born, was a bootlegger. But he wasn't bootlegging moonshine. He lived in St. Louis, Missouri. He was taking Canadian whiskey from Canada, running it through Illinois to East St. Louis. East St. Louis is a rough place today, and it always has been. And there were a lot of bars and a lot of mob-owned speakeasies there. So he was running Canadian whiskey from Canada to East St. Louis and ended up going to the penitentiary for it.
Wow.
And I wonder what would have happened if those two grandfathers had met each other. That would have been fireworks.
Oh, yeah, it wouldn't have gone well. No. I take that back. Your grandfather's too classy for that. He would have had his say, and then it would have been over.
Yeah,
He's
you're
not going to
right.
disrupt family.
Right, yeah. Yeah. My mother was dating a guy in the Marines, and they got engaged. And one day she went downtown, and downtown Woodland is like one caution light town. But there is a little alley between a couple of the buildings, a couple of the stores. And she looked down the alley and she saw her Marine fiance and my grandfather had him pinned up against the wall. And he was poking the guy in the chest. And my mother was too afraid to say anything to her father, so she just went home and she was a little bit upset. And about 30 minutes later, the Marine came over and he said, I need to get the engagement ring back. We can't get married.
Huh.
And she's never known what my grandfather said to the Marine. But I have to believe that my grandfather knew something about moonshiners in his family, and he didn't want to. And then only a month later, she married my father, and they stayed married for 65 years. So I kind of think that was a revenge marriage. He made her break up with the Marine, so she went and found her a guy in the Army at Fort Benning and married him. And he didn't know, little did he know, that guy's father was also a bootlegger because they never met.
Small world.
Yeah,
Tell you, 6 degrees of separation.
Yeah, you're right.
Hey, I want to ask you too, in the story, on top of all of the other stuff that's going on, this internal conflict.
Yes.
He's trying to figure out if he's going to stay as a revenue agent because he's not making a lot of money. He had to let the farm go. He's got a family to take care of. He's not really being able to take care of them. The time, all of this, versus leaving and doing something else that might not be his passion. There's no doubt in my mind this was your grandfather's passion. He was built to do this.
Yes.
Did he stay or did he go?
Well, I really love the way I ended the book, and I won't spoil it for your listeners, but you know what I'm talking about.
Yes.
That what he sees at the end of the book brings him back to calling. That's another big core meaning of the whole book. It's a book of calling. My calling is to be a storyteller. Your calling is to be a historian and podcaster. His calling was to stamp out liquor stills and catch bad guys. And there's stuff that happens at the end of the book that reminds him of his calling. So in real life, and I am writing a sequel, but I'll still go ahead and tip you off to this. He became Meriwether County Sheriff. You may remember they asked him to be the sheriff. So he did take that job. And something happened where my grandmother was so terrified that she just couldn't stop crying after he was only on the job for about a month. Meriwether County was a rough place. Just because John Wallace was convicted, he had a whole gang of guys. They called the Kingdom, and everybody was running scared because now one of their leader had been taken out and they were all pissed off. So my grandfather was confronting all that, and some things happened that terrified my grandmother. And he came home from the sheriff's office one day, and she was sitting in the floor holding my mother, rocking my mother, who was about 5 or 6 at the time. And they were both sobbing. And he said he didn't say anything to them. He just turned around and went up to the mayor's office and turned in his badge. Well, when he did that, the revenue department was dying to have him back. So he went back to being a revenue agent. And he did that for a couple more years. And then he had a conflict with one of the most powerful man in Georgia, Governor Gene Talmadge.
Oh, boy.
He saw Gene Talmadge do something that was a little bit corrupt, and Gene Talmadge knew that he saw him. And so my grandfather ended up in the middle of, you can, as a historian, please Google this. You'll love reading about it. What's called the Georgia Three Governors Controversy. And that's what my next book is going to be called, Moonshine and the Three Governors.
Excellent.
So In the final analysis, my grandfather did not survive the confrontation with the Georgia governor, and he was fired. And he always resented it. So he did end up getting a job in the bank there in Woodland and stayed there till he retired. But he was always like a caged lion. He did it because it made my grandmother comfortable, and it did pay more money, and he needed to take care of his family, and he needed to lower the stress level of my grandmother. But he always would look wistfully at the woods, and he and I quail hunted a lot when I was young, and we would be walking quail hunting somewhere in the woods, and he'd get a twinkle in his eye, and he'd say, "You see that stream?" He said, "If you go up about a half a mile, I found a still there one day, and those boys had that still hidden, blah, blah, blah," and he would tell the story. He loved to talk about the tracking and how he found the stills and some of the funny arrests, because a lot of the arrests weren't violent. But when you got to the darker stuff, he would just shut down.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, what is your next project? But you've kind of given it away a little bit. Is there anything else you have churning in there?
I'm doing Moonshine and Three Governors. I just published 2 weeks ago my first book of short stories, my first nonfiction book. And those short stories are basically, it's my life story, but I don't want to call it a memoir because it's not all chronological. It's a survivor story. I had some abuse in my background, and it's not a woe is me book at all. It's a book about, hey, if you're reading this and you're going through a tough challenge, I made it, and you're going to make it too. You may have looked at some of my history, and I went from being a chemist at a coal power plant to being appointed as a gubernatorial speechwriter. So I wrote speeches for the governor of Kentucky for his whole 4-year administration. And then I got appointed to the Trump administration. And I got to write a speech for Vice President Pence. This was the first administration, a speech for President Trump. And then one day I was on my way home from work and I collapsed on the sidewalk in D.C.
Oh, no.
And I didn't know I was sick or anything. And I'm in D.C. I don't even have furniture moved yet. I've only been up there about 7 or 8 weeks. And I went to a series of doctors, and I was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. I had blood cancer, and I had almost no red blood cells left when they realized I was sick. They told me I had a 2% chance to survive.
Oh, my God.
And I had not just leukemia, I had the deadliest form of leukemia in the world. So the book is about some of the childhood things I survived, and then about surviving the deadliest leukemia in the world. And I write it as a love letter and encouragement to others, because I know a lot of people are going through challenges right now, and I just want to build people up and give them something to be inspired by. I want to give them a hand up.
Yeah, that is really powerful. Oh, well, thank God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The title of the book is Showdown at the Beanstalk. And I call it that because a third of the stories are humor stories. I used to love to make people laugh, and I still do. And so a third of them are humor stories. And that particular story is about when I was 5 and I was obsessed with Matt Dillon. So I was always pretending to be Matt Dillon. We had a little farm at the time. I rode my stick horse out on the farm, and somehow I got it in my little 5-year-old head that the giant from Jack and the Beanstalk had moved onto our farm. And me and my 6-shooter had to take him on. So that's the first story in the book.
That's showing your creativity right there.
Yeah, I guess it was.
That sounds fantastic. Well, I do want to mention that I have already gotten your book, The Rain.
Oh, great.
Because that was just intriguing to me. Sounds like it's very much a gritty, realistic version. Yeah. I have not read that yet, but I will get to it.
A guy at a church inspired me to write. I was looking for a book to write, and this was 1999, 2000. I was trying to write Moonshine Over Georgia, and I couldn't get past the first page. I did keep the first page, by the way, and it's still in the book, but I just kept getting stuck. I'd never written a book before. I was a short story writer at the time. I had several short stories published at the time. This guy came up to me at a church I was speaking at once, and he said, "I've got an idea for a book, but I'm never going to write it. I'm not a writer. Would you listen to the concept and see if you think it could be something?" And he said, "I've only written the first sentence. And I wrote it on a little piece of paper like a fortune cookie, and I've got it in my wallet." So I said, "Okay, what's the concept?" And he says, "Noah and the ark. But everything you see about Noah's got his arm around a giraffe, and they're riding on a fun little boat ride. And it's a kid's story. It's a pop-up book." He said, "But if it really happened, it had to be the most terrifying event in human history."
Yeah.
I said, "You've got my attention. What's the sentence?" He gets his wallet out, gets his little piece of paper out, and he read it. We covered our ears to block out the screams. And I said, I'm going to write your book.
Hooked.
Yeah.
Gotcha. He hooked you right in.
Yeah. And, I have gotten postcards from around the world on that book. I got a postcard from Saudi Arabia that's so dear to me from a man with a Muslim name. And he said, your book helped me be a better man. That was the whole postcard.
History teacher here. Noah is very much a part of the Quran.
Right. And I didn't know that at the time. I learned it afterward.
Yeah. I'm not surprised. I cannot testify about that one yet, but it intrigued me.
Thank you.
I did not know the backstory, though. You're going to laugh because in my opening, I talk about how this is not Noah hugging giraffes. And you just said that.
Yeah.
I'm like, whoa.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's exactly right.
Yeah, that was wild.
Can I tell you one story about the creative process of Moonshine Over Georgia that blew my mind?
Please, tell me anything you want.
So when I was writing the story, this is back when I was first getting started. So I wrote The Rain, I wrote The Tower, I wrote a book called Going Green, which now may be one of my better plots, but it's sadly out of print, but I'm about to republish it with a different title. So by then I'd written 3 books, kind of knew what I was doing. So I wanted to write Moonshine Over Georgia, and I would, when I write a book, I like to go away to a cabin or somewhere completely quiet and just saturate myself in the story. And so I was walking around, hiking, thinking, all right, what do I want this story to be? I don't want to just retell murder in Coweta County from my grandfather's perspective. I want it to be more than that. So A, I want another big case. And then I found the Upson County liquor gang case, which you've already talked about. But B, I think it would be really compelling as a novel if my grandfather had a pre-existing relationship with Wilson Turner. So I'm going to have my grandfather find Wilson Turner at a small still that he has on his own, and he's going to try to turn Wilson Turner into his informant. Mm-hmm. So I wrote the first chapter, which after the prologue, which you have in the book today. I barely changed it at all. And then I ended up writing the whole first draft. Took me about 1.5 years. And after that is when I started getting in touch with some of these other historians in Georgia and Alabama that were sharing information. Right. One of them sent me a copy of the John Wallace trial transcripts. Huge treasure. I mean, it's so good to have. And so I knew my grandfather testified for quite a long time in that trial. So I got the manila envelope. I ripped it open when I got it. I couldn't turn to the page fast enough. And then I found the testimony of Agent Miller, and I start reading. And the DA is asking him all about the midnight meeting. So you know that from what we've talked about already. So he says, when you told Wallace that you would not run Turner out of the state, and my grandfather says, I think I can tell your listeners this and it won't spoil anything. He says, Wallace, you're a liar. He's not making liquor on your property without your permission. He's making liquor on your property as your employee. And you're not going to have to worry about him being on your land much longer, because I'm going to find your still and I'm going to put you both in the penitentiary. Nobody talked to this guy like this. So my grandfather told me Wallace just started shaking with rage. And then he got out of the car and slammed the door. Well, that's as far as my grandfather and I ever talked about. So I thought after Wallace got out and slammed the door, the meeting was over. The transcripts corrected that notion. So the DA says, well, then what happened? And my grandfather says, in a minute, he came back and knocked on the window, and I rolled the window down. And he said, if you won't run Turner out of the state of Georgia on my say-so, I'll show you where he's got a little side still on his own. And my grandfather said, I already knew he had a side still, but I wanted to see if Wallace would really show it to me. So I said, okay, let's go. So it's already like 12:30 at night, and he lets this killer get back in his car, and they take off riding down the dirt roads, which all the roads back then were dirt. By the way, I took my grandfather to these places when he was 93, the year before he died, and he told me a bunch more stuff. So in the testimony, he says, now, as you approached, in Georgia, you have these little dirt trails called logging roads. They're barely even roads. He says, as you approached the logging road where you were going to have to turn to go to Turner Still, you saw Turner coming out of the logging road, didn't you? And my grandfather said, yes, sir, I did. And he said, what happened then? And he said, I turned to Wallace and I said, man, I wish you weren't in this car with me. I sure would love to run him. The revenue agents, and I heard this from Doc Cook and my grandfather a lot, they used run him in 3 different ways. It might mean car chase, it might mean foot chase, or it might mean process him into jail. Yep. I ran him, there's a sentence in the book, I ran him for drunk and disorderly and he did 30 days for it. Well, that meant I jailed him. But in this case, it meant a car chase. So Wallace says, well, if you want to chase him, just put me out. So he puts Wallace out on the shoulder of the road in the middle of nowhere, Georgia, in the middle of the night, and takes off after Turner. So the DA says, and you were able to overtake Turner's truck and run him off the road, weren't you? My grandfather said, yes, sir, I was. And he said, Turner came out of that truck. He was fighting mad, wasn't he? My grandfather said, yes, sir, he was really mad. And he said, and he gave you what for, didn't he? And my grandfather said, well, he attempted to, but he did not succeed. And they never say any more about that. I would love to know how that went down. And he says, now at that time, did you try to turn Wilson Turner into your informant? I got chill bumps. I didn't know that really happened. I had already written my book. My grandfather never told me that. And my grandfather said, yes, sir, I did. And he said, what did Turner say? He said, Wallace stood up for me in court a few years ago when you arrested me before. Any man stands up for me in court, I ain't going back on him. That part was so good, I did take it and put it in the scene that you have in your book now. I had to include that. And he said, so he would not agree to be your informant. He said, no, sir, he wouldn't, but he'd probably be alive today if he had. So he says, now this small still that Turner had on the side, where was it located? Okay, when I did my research, I went down to the Stovall area. My mother-in-law actually owns 200 acres there. I told you about her grandfather grew up. She still has that land. There's no house there. It's just woods. So I went down there and I camped. And I wanted to be in the woods near John Wallace's house in the middle of the night to get the feel. And it was really creepy. Then I started making up this scene about Turner's still. I'm going back in time now. And I said, where do I want his still to be? So I was walking around with a map and I found a little spring. There's a lot of cold water springs there and warm water springs. That's where Warm Springs got its name. And I found this spring called White Sulphur Spring. So I was like, I love the way that name sounds. I'm going to put Turner's pretend still on White Sulphur Springs. Well, then I find out a year and a half later in this trial transcript, he did have a still. So the DA says, when you found Turner's still, where was it located? And my grandfather said on White Sulphur Spring. So I don't believe in communicating with the dead, but somehow my grandfather sent me that message.
There's no doubt in my mind. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that you were doing the right thing in telling this story, and he was giving you a little eternal help.
Yeah, and there's more instances of that sometime if we talk again, where that came up that just were mind-blowing and just really chill bump stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Chris, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for having me.
It has just been a pleasure.
And if you read The Rain and you want to talk about it, get back in touch with me. We've got each other's contact info. So
Absolutely. It takes me a while. I'm usually reading about 10 books at a time.
Yeah, no problem.
I won't be calling you next week, but
Yeah.
I really am looking forward to that. Thank you. This has just been the most delightful conversation.
Thank you.
I'm glad to know that a man like your grandfather walked the earth.
Thank
Great
you.
story, great resources. Wow, very powerful.
I said I was going to shut up, but one more thing. The chapter in the book, It Rattles a Man.
Mm-hmm.
You remember he went to the truck stop right after the crime occurred.
Yes.
And my grandfather has a conversation with the truck stop cook, an owner named Steve Smith, who was a big burly guy. Steve Smith had just witnessed the murder like an hour before, or witnessed the beating, the assault. I stand corrected. Yes. And I wanted to really grab that emotion. And as I was writing it, I was actually writing that chapter in a small cabin way up in the mountains of Kentucky. I had a little potbelly stove. It was a perfect writing environment, especially for this book. And I thought to myself, these were two men of 1946. They had not seen blood and gore on their movie screens. They didn't see nightly violence. They didn't even have televisions, much less see violence on it. They had radio shows.
Right.
So to witness what he had witnessed would be hugely emotional for him. So that's where I came up with the title of the chapter, It Rattles a Man. And you may remember Steve Smith says, something like I seen today, it rattles a man.
Yes.
In my opinion, this is 5 books for me now. That's the best 5 pages I've ever written. I love that scene, and I love the way that scene ends. And I don't think this will spoil it for anybody. I'll just paraphrase it. My grandfather said, Steve Smith has said it rattles a man 3 or 4 times, and he's described in detail the severe beating that he saw Wilson Turner receive. And my grandfather steps out towards the pavement, puts the Stetson back on, which he always does that. That's kind of symbolic of it's time to go back to work. Mm-hmm. And he said, I looked down the pavement and it was white hot and the heat waves were still shimmering off the asphalt. I looked to that imaginary line that separated Meriwether and Coweta County, the line that all this trouble had moved across. It was a line that I knew I had to cross and trouble that I knew I had to get in the middle of. Mm-hmm. And then Steve Smith choked up again. He says, what I seen today, Mr. Miller, I wish I'd never seen it. It rattles a man. And my grandfather said, yeah, I know what you mean. And when I wrote those words, I was like, boom, baby.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, that was, there's a number of powerful scenes like that. I really enjoyed it. Of course it comes out the right way, but some books I read don't, but this one, it came out the right way.
Well, thank you. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, Chris, you take care.
Okay, take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye now. Murder Bookies. I'm fangirling a lot here. I really hope you enjoyed this interview with Chris Gates. I know it's not our usual true crime book, but I am telling you, there's so much realism. It's rooted in the factual stories. With summer coming, I really hope that you will pick up Moonshine Over Georgia, a novel based on real events. It had my heart pounding, it had my mind racing. I was so engaged with the characters. So I do have a link on my blog where you can purchase Chris's book on Amazon. I have show notes, photos, all my sources, that research that I did. And you can find that, of course, at www.murdershelfbookclub.com, June 2025. Thank you for listening. As always, trust your gut. I will have a new episode out very shortly, featuring some of the best true crime books out there. And after doing a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you listen, introduce your family and friends to my podcast. Have a new episode listening party and discuss it at home. Contact me at jill@murdershelfbookclub.com. You can find me on X, Facebook, Instagram, and on YouTube too. And on YouTube. YouTube. I may have to leave that in here. I'll see you in 2 weeks, Murder Bookies. Written and produced by Jill, all rights reserved. Music, The Pewter Elephant by Blue Dot Sessions.